Okay, that looks like we've got the majority of people. Good morning, everybody. My name is Alex Mackay and I work for Nature Scott, and I'm your convener for this webinar this morning. Thank you very much for joining us. This is Nature Scott's webinar on Reflowering Scotland's woodland. I've just got a couple of housekeeping announcements that I want to run through with you before I introduce the panel and we kick off the session this morning. So just to let you know that we are recording this session, just so that you're aware of that. And the recording will be made available on our websites and other people's websites, other partners' websites in due course. And just also to let you know that the data we collected in setting up this webinar is only going to be used for this purpose. It won't be stored for any other purpose. Everybody's video and speakers are turned off apart from myself and the panelists, but we do have a question and answer box at the bottom. And so as we're going through the presentations, if you have any questions, pop them in that question and answer box. And then we've got a couple of discussion sessions. And so I will read out the questions and our panelists will be able to answer them for you. We also do have the chat box available if there are any general comments you want to make, but if you can pop the questions and answers in the box, that would be great. And I think that's just about all I have to say housekeeping wise. So I'll just introduce our speakers, our panelists today. We have Kate Hall from Nature Scott, our woodland advisor. We've got Elisa Fuentes Montemayor, senior researcher at Stirling University. Rick Worrell, an independent forestry consultant. Giles Raverack from Scotia Seeds, and Colin Edwards, who's the Environment Policy Advisor in Scottish Forestry. So I hope you enjoy this morning's webinar, and I will now hand over to Kate, who will kick us off with the first session this morning on the nature of the challenge of and plant translocations as a solution. Thanks, Kate.
Okay, good morning, everybody, and it's great that so many of you have joined us this morning to look at this really fascinating subject of reflowering Scotland's woodlands. My neighbour's just pulling his bin down past the house, so I don't know if you can hear that. Sounds like thunder in the background. Anyway, one of the main aims of this webinar is to introduce this recently published guidance on how to establish woodland plants in broadleaf woods. The guidance is a collaboration between Rick Worrell, who you'll be hearing from a little later, and a number of organisations, Plant Life Scotland, Scottish Forestry, Scotia Seeds, SRUC, the Rural College, and Stirling University, Nature Scott, and Carol Crawford, who was involved in the early work. And the work was funded by the Patsy Wood Trust and supported by Scottish Forestry and Nature Scott. In the webinar, we'll be hearing about some brand new results from a research project that's looking at the long-term development of woodland vegetation in temperate woodland creation sites, some tips on the pros and cons of wildflower seed self-collecting as opposed to the use of commercial seed sources, and some early results from woodland wildflower establishment trials. But as much as anything, this is an opportunity for you to ask your questions and share your experience. So we encourage you to post these as early as you can, please, in the Q&A box to give our moderator, Alex, time to digest and collate these. There's going to be 2 separate discussion sessions in the webinar, so you can check your programs to see when they are, and an opportunity at the end that we want to put to you to discuss the idea of setting up an online forum to support sharing expertise and experience and promoting the concept of responsible woodland plant translocations. So I'll just give a very brief introduction to the background to this piece of work and the current situation. So creation of of newly planted broadleaf woodlands in Scotland over the past few decades has generally proceeded with little or no thought for how to develop a natural woodland flora in the long term. When new woodlands are created on mainly semi-natural vegetation, such as in the picture here in the uplands, southern Scotland, leaving the development of woodland vegetation more or less to natural processes is an acceptable position, because there'll usually be seed or plants present within the vegetation or nearby that can act as sources for colonization of the new woodland. Initially, our expectations were that woodlands planted on improved pasture, arable land and brownfield sites and so on would in time naturally acquire the assemblage of associated plants and other species. However, our experience now from the past 40 years has shown that this has failed to happen in the majority of cases. And whilst these woods may acquire a few woodland species by natural colonization, they generally tend fail to develop authentic woodland plant communities, because the woodland plants are either missing from the seed bank or are not present in adjacent habitats. So where the new woodland is adjacent to a semi-natural woodland or is part of a forest habitat network, woodland plants we would expect will gradually colonize the new woodland over the course of decades or centuries, with the semi-natural woodland acting as a source of species. However, where the new woodland is isolated or in a location where woodland plants are missing, in the wider landscape, very little colonization of woodland plants will take place. And this is particularly true for the woodland specialists, many of which have heavy seeds that are known to have poor dispersal capabilities. So if we want woodland plant communities to develop in these sites within a human timescale, we're going to have to intervene. And oopsie, once you start thinking about the woodland flowers, you will need to consider whether herbivores may be having an influence on the ability of plants to colonize new and existing sites. Because herbivores preferentially eat some plants, and they often select for the flowers, as you can see in this picture. And this obviously will limit the possibilities for expansion from seed within your woodland. Scientists and managers have now spent 30 years or so investigating methods of establishing woodland plants in situations where colonization might not be expected to happen naturally. A variety of approaches have been trialed, ranging from planting small quantities of seed or plants in mature woodland through to soil inversion and large-scale reseeding of land at the time of tree planting. And happily, this work has shown that establishment of woodland plants in young woodland can markedly improve the ecological condition of the woods compared with areas lacking. So Nature Scott has just published this guide, as we've said. It's now available to download through our website, and it contains lots of advice on issues such as when to collect seed and how to store it, as well as up-to-date advice on the legislation that relates to the translocation of species, especially when this is out with their native range in Scotland. The new guide draws on this body of experience and knowledge to show how the transformation of newly planted woods into beautiful and biodiverse places like this ancient woodland can be helped by planting common woodland wildflowers and grasses, and it's something that we can all get involved in. And the work starts now, working out which woodland plants you can already be going out and collecting seed from. So yeah, thank you very much. And
thanks, Kate. That was really good introduction to the report, and hopefully everybody will be able to download it and digest all that's in it. Right, the next person is Eliza. She's going to talk the long-term development of temperate woodland creation sites from tree saplings to mature woodlands.
Thanks, Alex. I'll just try and start sharing my screen just now. Right. Hopefully that's coming up now as in presentation mode.
Yes, it is.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for being here. My name is Elisa Fuentes Montemayor. I'm a senior research fellow at Scotland's Rural College and also an honorary senior lecturer at the University of Stirling. I'm going to talk to you today about some work we've been doing as part of the Woodland Creation and Ecological Networks, or WREN project, which is a collaboration co-led by Forest Research, the University of Stirling, SRUC and Natural England. And the work I'll be presenting today focuses on the long-term development of temperate woodland creation sites. So the WREN project uses a natural experiment approach to assess the effects of past landscape change on current biodiversity and ecosystem functioning to inform future restoration actions. And for this, we have been focusing on woodlands which have been historically created on former agricultural land to mimic current reforestation strategies. We have been using historic maps like the one you can see on your screens, which is from the 1860s. And there you can see in the middle of your screens what used to be an agricultural field. We can then flash forward to the 1900s, where we can see a woodland patch appearing on that former agricultural land. And if we flash forward again, we can see that woodland patch in the current landscape, which we selected as one of our study sites in 2014. And using this approach, we have systematically selected a range of woodland patches to reflect variation in key local and landscape level attributes, which we think are important for biodiversity. So, for example, at the local scale, we have quantified things like patch size, tree species richness, amount of understory cover, and a range of other vegetation characteristics. And then at the landscape scale, we have been measuring things like the amount of woodland and the degree of connectivity of that woodland, and also the permeability of the non-woodland habitat. We have then gone and surveyed all of these sites for a range of woodland-dependent species and recorded those which have colonized and established in these sites so far. And to date, we have surveyed more than 100 woodlands in 2 study areas and recorded more than 1,000 species that have managed to make it into these woodlands so far. We are using a range of different statistical approaches to link species data with woodland characteristics to try to identify those attributes that are influencing species colonization and establishment. And one of the taxonomic groups that we have been surveying is, of course, vascular plants that I will be talking about a bit later today. But before I talk about the ground flora, I'd like to just quickly run through some recent results that we got looking at the vegetation development of woodland creation sites, and in particular looking at what happened to the trees and the habitat structure of woodland creation sites. And what we did was we categorized all of our secondary woodlands according to their age, which ranged from 10 to 160 years since planting. And then we used existing literature to class them into different woodland development stages. And we also surveyed much older ancient woodlands, which have been wooded, continuously wooded for at least 250 years. We described the vegetation structure of all of our sites using kind of traditional field surveying methods to quantify things like, for example, tree density and tree diameter. And then we used a multivariate analysis technique called linear discriminant analysis, which allows us to basically summarize the variation explained by all of these different vegetation attributes, and then quantify the degree of similarity between woodlands in different development stages. And in addition to that, we also use open access LiDAR data to quantify the vertical complexity of the woodlands by creating vegetation height plots. And looking at the results, firstly focusing on the data that we collected in the field, we see moderate differences in the structure of woodlands in different development stages. So these plots here show you the values, so there are histograms of the values which summarize the vegetation characteristics of the sites in each of the developmental stages. And without going into much detail, the key thing to look at here is that there is a gradual transition, young sites going from stand initiation stages through to stem exclusion and then understory reinitiation. We can see a gradual transition of these values going kind of from the left of the graphs to increasing in value towards the right of the graphs. And that basically means that the vegetation is transitioning over time. But we also see a lot of overlap between woodlands in understory reinitiation stages and ancient woodlands, indicating that the vegetation structure of these groups is actually quite similar. And in terms of the specific vegetation attributes that are driving these differences here, we found that one of the most important drivers of those differences is variation in tree diameter. So as woodland matures, the trees, there's obviously larger trees, but there's also higher variation in tree sizes. So we get a mix of big trees with kind of smaller trees as well. And that is accompanied by a gradual decrease in tree density over time. Now looking at the results we got from the LiDAR data, we can see these plots here showing vegetation height in meters. And we see, as you would expect, that younger sites are dominated by relatively short vegetation, small trees. And then the trees grow and form a kind of dense canopy without pretty much, there's nothing much going on under the canopy. We see very little vegetation closer to the ground. And then sites in understory reinitiation stages and ancient woodlands are again looking very similar in terms of their vegetation height distribution. And they display a kind of more even vegetation height of the trees and shrubs in those woodlands. And this is what we actually see in our sites, but if we compare it to what we would expect to see based on what we know from the literature, we see that actually we are missing what should be the characteristic peak of woodlands in understory reinitiation stages. And we think that might be because of excessive herbivory pressure by both domestic and wild browsers and grazers in these woodlands, which may be kind of limiting the tree recruitment and natural regeneration in some sites. Now, very quickly, just to mention some of the work that's being led by my colleague, Kevin Watts at Forest Research. We are interested in two key questions, focusing on vascular plants and ground flora in woodland creation sites. Firstly, whether or not woodland plants are actually able to colonize and establish in secondary woodlands. And we are also interested in identifying those local and landscape level attributes that influence plant species colonization and establishment. So we've surveyed all of our woodland creation sites, and then we've categorized plant species as either generalist or specialist woodland plants. And then we've been conducting some preliminary analysis to explore the influence of local and landscape characteristics on plant species presence and species richness. Just a couple of plots to give you an idea of the kind of species composition, plant species composition of the our woodland creation sites. Firstly, for generalist woodland plants, we can see there's quite a lot, more than 80 species we've recorded in our sites, and most of them are very common. So this is the proportion of sites that are occupied by each of the species. Some of them are like stinging nettles are very, very common and being present in almost every single one of our sites. And when we look at the factors that are important in determining the species richness of this, the group of generalist woodland plants, we see that woodland size and woodland age are important. So with more species in larger woodlands and also more species in younger woodlands. And then we see a gradual decrease in the number of woodland generalists mature. And then these species are gradually being replaced by specialist species, as I will show you in the next graph. So this one here is showing the proportion of sites occupied by specialist woodland plants. You can see there's fewer species compared to the generalist, and there's also the proportion of sites occupied by specialists is much lower than what we see for generalist species. And these results have help us, so they're useful as evidence to inform the selection of species which might be most in need of conservation translocations. So we see some species like Silene dioica, which are more or less managing okay to colonize a good proportion of woodland creation sites. But we can also identify some species which are only present in a very small proportion of our sites, or some other species which are actually not making it there at all. And finally, just to say a little bit about the factors which are influencing the species richness of specialist woodland plants. We see positive effects of woodland size, so more species in larger woodlands. We also see negative impacts of the presence of grazing stock in the woodlands, and a positive effect of age, but this is actually an indirect effect, which is being mediated by vegetation structure. So all the woodlands having higher structural heterogeneity tend to have a larger number of woodland specialist plants. And we're also, we know that woodland the role that hedges and trees outside of woodlands have in terms of facilitating the dispersal of this group of plants. That's all I have to say for now. Thanks to all the my co-authors and collaborators, and feel free to get in touch if you want to find out more about this project.
Thanks very much, Lisa. That was really interesting, learning about the development of habitats under the woodland. So that's great. Just a quick reminder, if you want to put any questions, we have a question and answer box. Some people have already been sending in some questions, which is great. If you have any others, pop them in that question and answer box at the bottom, and we'll answer them in the discussion session. Right, moving swiftly on, we have Rick Worrell next, who's going to speak about the introduction of the guidance that's been written. So I'd like to welcome Rick.
Thanks very much. Let me just get the screen up here. Is everybody seeing the slideshow now?
Yes, it's there. Great, thanks.
Grand. So I'm a forestry consultant, and I got interested in this by working in broadleaved woods and noticing that in planted woods in the lowlands, that plant communities were often very poor. And many of you will recognize scenes like these in kind of young and pole stage woodlands. Here's a woodland more or less swamped by agricultural weeds. And also you find this even in planted woods as old as 150 years old. Quite often you have nothing really that you might call a woodland plant community. So in terms of the interim guidance, I just want to run through three things: what the information in the guidance is built on, and then quickly through aims, principles and scope, and then touch on some key practical issues, many of which actually we don't yet know all the answers to. So the guidance is based on a review of woodland plant translocation projects in the UK. We collated as much literature as we could. We visited as many sites as we could. And we talked to practitioners, and we tried to distill out the main lessons from this range of different projects. So the guidance is really a synthesis of that knowledge. It's not based on a large amount of new research. Some of you will recall Joanna Francis's pioneering work in England. Then there's the work the Woodland Trust have done at Formant Hills in Fife and in their Forest of Flowers project. And then work done by Landlife, based in Liverpool, who were interested in establishing woodland plants at the time of planting the woods. In addition to that, there are a number of university projects and projects done by private woodland owners, including some that I've been involved with myself. We also did a very basic literature review of international experience. And as you heard, we got hooked in with Stirling University's Wren project. And finally, Scotia Seeds have added in some useful new information about seed collection. The conclusions of all this, well, we discovered that experience to date was in many respects quite inspiring, that the techniques work at least on some sites, and that it has potentially quite substantial biodiversity benefits, especially in the longer term. But at the same time, there were substantial limitations with many of these projects. They were firstly few in number. They were short term. They were often poorly monitored and recorded, and only a few had led to available kind of publications that were widely available. They often operated in isolation of each other, and so it was all rather extraordinarily ad hoc. And that is what has led to the inclusion in the title of the guidance of this word interim. And I think it's important because it signals that our knowledge of the topic is still at a very early stage, and there's a huge amount we still don't know. The more I work with the topic, the more I continue to find fairly fundamental issues that we don't understand properly. So whilst having the guidance is great, it does come with this important caveat of being interim. So onto the guidance itself. The aim is to foster naturalistic plant communities in planted woods where this is unlikely to happen naturally, and that usually means planted woods which are isolated from seed sources of woodland plants by agricultural land. And our approach that we're proposing is to establish small populations of woodland plants in the expectation that those will then spread by natural means over very long time periods. The aim is for it to be reasonably cheap process, so simply establishing what ecologists would call founder populations of plants, and then letting nature take its course in terms of moving those plants around within woodlands. The scope of the guidance is mainly to deal with the problem of existing woods, because we have significant areas of planted broadleaf woods, many of which have this problem. But we also cover how we might deal with woodland plants during native woodland creation, so at the point of planting. But the main focus is on existing woods. We are proposing a 4-step planning process. So more or less along these lines, we first assess which species are already present in the target woodland or in the woodland creation site, if you're doing this at planting, and then assess which species are present in adjacent woodlands and habitats which might colonize over time. Obviously, if species already exist at the site, it's far better that we maintain those local populations than we do introductions. Step 3 would be to assess which species would occur naturally in the woods. So that's a matter of assessing site conditions, canopy conditions, and working out which species would be naturally present. And then fourthly, from that, you can work out which species are missing from the woodland and unlikely to arrive by natural colonization. And from that, we can come up with a list of common woodland plants that could be introduced. The object of this planning process is to ensure we only translocate species that are genuinely missing and that we only establish plants that are site native. And what we're trying to avoid here is woodland owners simply deciding that they're going to plant their favorite species, bluebells or red campions, for example, irrespective of whether that is ecologically appropriate. So the interim guidance provides some advice around which species we might plant. We have a list of 37 target species, split between woodland specialist species and woodland edge species, and including a few grasses. So they're common woodland plants. They're characteristic of different woodland types, so roughly divided broadly into oak birch woods, ash woods, and alder woodlands. And some of the species are ancient woodland species. A final principle relates to genetic issues, and the aim here is to encourage natural colonization of local plant populations wherever possible and use locally sourced material in preference to commercial seed mixes. So we encourage practitioners as far as possible to collect their own seed and cuttings. So what I'd like to do now is just highlight some of the practical issues that people inevitably find themselves wondering about when they start site works of this type. So firstly, what is the deer population in the wood and what effects might deer have? So do we need to fence our plots of woodland plants, or is deer control that is in place is adequate? To what extent do we rely on seeds, or is it better to grow plants on and rooted cuttings and then plant those out? How do we go about collecting seed and cuttings? And how do we ensure that those come from a good number of parent plants? Because we don't want to start by introducing a genetically narrow base of founder plants. Is the existing vegetation likely to be a hindrance? And if it is, how do we deal with that? Then what level of shade is it best to do the introductions into? Finally, if planting plants, which mixtures of plant species might we plant together? And will some plant species come to dominate the site at the expense of others? The interim guidance provides basic information on most of those questions, but actually answering them properly requires more field evidence and experience, and ideally more organized research. So it's really important that land managers start to take this issue seriously. And we really need people to come forward and try this process out and to share experience. Obviously, plants are a fundamental part of the biodiversity of woodlands. And my feeling is they've largely gone under the radar so far, and particularly as we've moved tree planting down onto better agricultural ground. Having been involved with this for the last 20 years or so, I feel we're very much at the start of a process, but it's an exciting field to get involved with. And successful projects can have huge rewards. So I'm just going to end with an example here of a woodland I'm involved with. So it's a planted broadleaved woodland. It's now 13, 14 years. I was actually on a restuck site. This was formerly Sitka spruce. And this was achieved with about 100 grams of bluebell seed and some cuttings of greater stitchwort, and bugling some of the wetter patches. Yellow pimpernel was in there as well. The dog violet and the avens got there by themselves. And we planted in a few primrose as well. So in the right condition, a very small amount of effort can be quite transformative. And I'd like to end just by thanking my partners and funders. So that's me, Alex.
Thanks very much, Rick. That was great. And I think it's been really interesting hearing the background to the work that's gone on, the science behind it, and then we've moved on to some of the practical work. So I hope you've all enjoyed this first section of the morning. We're going to move into the discussion now. So I'm going to read out some of the questions that have been sent in through the question and answer text box, and our panelists will, I'm sure, be able to answer them. So let's start off with a question from Rosalind Forbes Adam. She's asking, it would be interesting to know how you envisage preparing land under trees for being hospitable to introduce wildlife plugs. How do you treat the arable field or grassland for the first 10 years while you are waiting? I don't know if this is one for either Giles or Elisa, maybe?
I was actually going to pass it on to Rick.
Yes, So I think the premise of the question is that the trees have been planted and you're waiting for the vegetation in the shade of the trees to kind of declare itself in terms of what is going to happen. My advice, I think, would be to leave the introduction of the plug plants until more or less the point of canopy closure. By that point, you've got a fair idea of the species that might arrive naturally. You've got a fair idea of the vigor and competitiveness of the vegetation that is developing. And then at the time when you want to do the works, ideally, you'd be looking for areas that are more or less free of vegetation, which does happen under some circumstances. Equally, you can get areas with very vigorous competing vegetation. And in those, if we're introducing small plots of woodland plants, I would suggest that it is worth considering getting rid of competitive vegetation with a treatment of Roundup. And that's certainly where I've been heading with recent trials. Having said that, there are conditions, there are vegetation conditions where plug plants take off remarkably well. Species like bugle and stitchwort can deal with a fair amount of vegetation competition. But it depends very much on the species that you're having to deal with. And some of the meadow grasses that can persist from former permanent pasture can be very competitive. And in conditions like that, I would suggest that more or less at the time of planting after 15 or 20 years, that is the point to do something. I haven't, to be honest, thought about doing things over a period prior to that to improve conditions, because it seems to me the vegetation is in such a transition for those first years after planting that I don't think that it would be worth attempting to do things, but it's a new thought to me, and that's quite an interesting one. So maybe Ro, we could have a chat about that after this event has finished.
I'd quite like just to respond to the second part of that question, what you do in the first years after you've planted the trees, because as Eliza showed, a great many of these sites have vegetation which includes things like stinging nettles, cleavers, roseberry willow herb, persistent, long-term, very vigorous plants, which can make it difficult to establish any woodland species later on. And I think it's worthwhile thinking about trying to suppress some of these species in the early years of a woodland planting, and just a simple sowing of some grass seed at the time of planting or immediately before planting can be very useful in doing that.
Thank you. Okay, right, we'll move on to another question. I think this one refers back to some of the research that Lisa was talking about. So from Michael Clark, grazing by herbivores is used by farmers to encourage plants to tiller. Intuitively, one might think herbivores in woods would accelerate colonization. Does your research not suggest not?
I think it might have to do with the degree of grazing, how much and by how long the sites are being grazed. It might be that a little bit of grazing it's all right and might be even beneficial, but it's quite easy for that to just be a bit too much, and actually for the herbivores to not allow any of the ground flora species to establish. So if they're there all the time in really high numbers, they're basically going to be eating everything that's trying to come up in the ground of these woodlands. So I would think it's got to do with that kind of intensity of grazing, rather than just being a yes or no answer. I don't know if Kate has anything to add to that.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Elisa. And I mean, depending on the herbivores that you have in the woodland, some deer are particularly selective in terms of what they are going for, and they actually will target some of the things, the very things that you're trying to encourage. So yes, they will, some herbivores will just swipe at vegetation in a general way and encourage, as you say, grasses to tiller. But if we're trying to encourage things like woodland herbs, or things like bramble, or things like honeysuckle, these are the very things that deer will be targeting and browsing down, and just as Elisa's work has shown. So controlling herbivores in the early stages of establishing woodland ground flora, I would say, is absolutely critical. And that means having pretty low, very low levels of herbivores. Yeah.
Thanks, Kate. Another one, I think, which Elisa, you might want to start off, and maybe one of the other panelists might want to come in on. Regarding vegetation development and woodland creation sites, can you plant trees at a wider distance from each other and skip over the plant suppressing stem exclusion stage?
I think it's really important to think that there's things we can do at the start in terms of how we plant the trees, in terms of spacing, for example, also tree species richness, things that are going to determine the kind of trajectory of those woodlands. Say if we have a more diverse woodland, different tree species that are going to grow at different rates, for example, over time result in a more kind of diverse structure of the woodland. That's something that we can start thinking of at the very start when we plant the trees. The spacing, I'm not really sure about. I think probably if we were to plant the trees with lots of spacing between them, that might allow more light to come in. But also, I think it's important just to keep in mind that it's going to take some time for the trees to develop that kind of diversity of sizes and the different structural layers So it's not just about tree density. I think we need to think about many other of the structural features that are going to be important for plants, but also for many other biodiversity groups in the long term, and also acknowledge that even though there's things we can do at the start and there's things we can do with management to accelerate that transition, for example, possibly thinning to kind of create and promote that structural diversity. There's also going to be things that are going to take time, and we just need to wait for that habitat development to happen, even though we can hopefully help it a little bit along the way with some management.
Thank you, Lisa. Another one which...
Sorry, Alex, can I just
yeah.
add to that a little bit? Just to make the point that anybody who's receiving Forestry Commission grant for woodland establishment has to achieve a certain density of trees to comply, and that density is to be maintained until year 20 of the contract. It's an interesting question, and obviously I think what Elisa said there about the density of trees allowing the formation of structural diversity and gaps, etc., is an interesting one, and is one I think we'll need to look at in the future. It's currently not something that we would advocate. If somebody's receiving grants, we would certainly expect them to get the trees established and then think about follow-on stages from that.
Thanks, Colin. Our next question is linked. At what point in the new woodland development is the optimum time for assessing what vascular species are missing and what might be worth introducing? I don't know if that's one Rick wants to come in on.
Yeah, sure. I think the optimal time, it can be done at obviously at a variety of stages. I think the optimal time is somewhere around canopy closure. If we're talking about existing woods, obviously we don't have much of a choice in this, because a wood is at the stage it's at, and we have to go in and do the analysis at that point. In most instances, it wouldn't be worth doing this before about year 20. I don't think in a planted wood that the vegetation has declared itself before about that stage. 15 or 20, you'll have a decent idea of what is likely to be there by natural means. So that's where I'd be heading, would be the early few decades.
Somebody else want to come in on that? No? Okay. Okay, we have another question. In many cases, there can be a significant seed bank in the soil of different plants. Is there any thought to soil disturbance as a means to stimulate new plants? Pigs and cattle can be good agents for this. Also, machinery used in thinning and harvesting. Our young Croft woodland has gained a lot of new species since we started disturbing the ground through human and animal activity. Is that one for Rick?
I have to say that is not one that I have experience of. It is true that in some circumstances, particularly if you're in more of a semi-natural situation, that that plants do appear from the seed bank. So, for example, in the woodland I showed you, which was formerly Sitka spruce, we had 5 or 6 plant species that appeared from the seed bank. Species like dog violet and heath bedstraw, which is quite a surprise to us, and persisted there for 40 years. So those appeared. The role of herbivores in doing that, I have to say I don't know anything about, but we would run into problems in the woodland situation, as Kate was talking about, in terms of having those herbivores present in the early stages and being more likely to impede than encourage the development of woodland flora. Obviously, as the process goes on and you acquire more and more woodland species, I can see a role for grazing, moving those around within the woodland. So I think once you've got your plants, it would be important to have some level of grazing as a means of spreading the plants around within the woodland.
Can I just come in there, please, Alex? Just to add to that, Rick, I think it's very difficult to kind of say categorically. It really depends on the kind of woodland and the herbivores, and I think the best bit of advice I can offer is that, you know, as Rick has already said, we're at the start of this process and we're learning all the time. It's about getting to know your site and watching what happens, because it's astonishing what things will come in and seed themselves. And similarly, you know, introducing herbivores. I mean, I've had my daughter's horses grazing over a patch of very boring grassland last year. And this year I've been amazed at the plants that have come in there just because, you know, it was heavily grazed last year. So, you know, natural colonization will happen if we create the right situation, the right circumstances to allow it to happen. So it's about watching, observing, and working with the natural processes. And I think what we would, you know, kind of strongly encourage you all to do.
Thanks, Kate.
Generally speaking, disturbance is a very important factor in releasing seeds from a soil seed bank. So if you've got reason to think that you might have woodland species already present in the soil, some disturbance can be quite a good thing. I think a lot of the sites that we're talking about, though, are sites which have been in arable agriculture for a long time, or other uses where there's been no woodland, and so there is simply no soil seed bank of woodland species there. So that's why we're thinking about introducing some material.
Thanks, Giles. I think we've just got time for one quick more question. We'll have another discussion session towards the end, so keep your questions coming. One quick one: is there a system for registering where woodland plants have been seeded, so that national recording organisations such as BSBI know that this has been done by human hand and does not represent a sudden change in the range of the species concerned? Kate, is that one for you?
I can certainly comment on that, because this is something that we have thought a lot about. I mean, obviously the report refers to the Scottish Code of Conservation Translocations. So the work that we are recommending that is done in terms of woodland ground flora restoration is within that code of practice. But what I would say, I think, in response to that question, which is a really good question, and thank you, Ro, for raising it, is that what we are recommending planting is the common species. So, you know, these are as Rick has already identified, these are the species that you are finding in the adjacent woodlands anyway. So we're not recommending that people are going out and planting the rare and unusual things. These are the everyday kind of common and garden things that you would expect to find in most woodlands in that part of the country where you are. And there is a list in the report of the species that we're talking about, as Rick has indicated in his talk. So it partly answers the question. No, we don't have a system of whereby people can record what they're planting in their woodlands. If we move at some point to this work being funded by grant assistance, it is potentially possible at that point that work that is being done under grant aid could then be documented, and that is a way in which we could gather what's being done on different sites. But at the moment, there isn't a system.
Thanks, Kate. Right, I think we need to move on. As I say, we'll have another chance to answer more questions towards the end. I'd now like to introduce Giles Laverack, who's going to talk about seed and plant sources.
Can you see that okay?
Yes, that's fine, thanks.
Okay, that's great. So I'm Giles Laverack from Scotia Seeds, and the report, the guidance that we've published, which we're talking about, is very much focused on small scale and low cost methods for introducing plants into woodlands. And it gives some guidance about the species selections and the methods. We thought about 3 different approaches to doing it, 3 different types of material. So seeds, which are obvious enough, what we called plant fragments, by which we mean runners and roots or parts of plants, and then finally plants, by which we were thinking of plants that have been grown as plugs or pots. And I'd like to just kind of summarize the advantages and possible disadvantages of using these different kinds of materials. So we thought of 2 different approaches to doing this: either do it yourself with material that you've gathered yourself, or to buy materials from commercial suppliers. So if you do it yourself, you can be fairly sure that you're using very local origin material if you collect seeds from around about in the local area. It's a very nice sort of community activity. It can be good to do it as a group, or it's very enjoyable just to collect seeds by yourself, and people like doing this kind of thing. So it's a very good way to focus on the plants themselves and often get people involved. And it's also free in terms of you don't have to part with any cash to be able to do this. On the other hand, it's not free in terms of time. It can be very time consuming and take up a lot of time. You need to have a certain amount of knowledge of seed maturation and just to be able to make sure that you do collect seed when it's properly ripe and that you treat it properly, so that the seeds are actually viable when you come to use them. And you do need to work out where the plants are that you might collect them from, and you may well need permission to be able to collect seeds. I mean, if you're collecting on other people's property, you should have permission to do it. If you're to buy seeds, well, it can be very convenient to do that, and you might have availability of more species than you can collect by yourself. You should be able to assume that you have good seed quality in the material.
Sorry, Giles, can I just interrupt? I think that your slide is not showing in full screen and a couple of people are struggling to see it. I don't know if you can maximize it. If not, don't worry.
How can I do that?
Just sort of present it. So rather than just in sort of slideshow view.
I'll go back.
Giles, if you may,
Has that changed anything?
No. If you just go back to the options again.
Hi, Giles. If you stop sharing your screen and then put it into presentation mode and then share your screen again, it should do the trick.
Okay. Presentation mode, how do I do that?
Just if you start the slideshow.
Has that changed it?
No, don't worry, just.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. Apologies to anyone who can't see it properly. I can't see how to alter that. Okay, shall I just continue?
Yes, just carry on.
Okay. Yes, if you're buying seeds, then they're generally cheaper to use than plants. You get a lot more seeds for your money. I put local origin in amber rather than green or red because you might get local origin seeds or you might not be able to find them. And some species are just not practical to deal with by seed. For example, you have recalcitrant seeds where the seeds don't withstand drying, as with oak seeds, for example, you might be familiar with, but species like wood anemone fall into that category. So you can't handle them as seeds easily at all. If you look at plant fragments, then they're quicker to establish than seeds, and generally they don't cost you much time to collect. They're a bit less robust than plants, and you have to be aware that they are potentially destructive in that if you're uprooting or cutting plants, you might cause some damage. That material is just not available to buy. I don't think anyone is selling parts of plants in that way. And if you look at plants, if you raise plants yourself, it's quite cheap. The establishment, once you put plants into your woodland, is relatively much quicker than using seeds, and the plants will be more competitive against established vegetation than if you use a seed source. But you do need the time and space to raise plants, so it can take quite a long time to raise plants. If you buy them, then you've got them instantly, and they're generally robust. I put a question mark against availability because sources are quite limited at the moment. And you do need to be a bit careful about the possibility of introducing pests and disease if you're transporting soil or compost along with the plants. So there's the summary of pros and cons for the different methods there. In fact, I think what a lot of projects will do is to use a combination of different sources of material. So, for example, you might collect red campion seeds yourself. They're an easy species and very common. You might buy a seed mix of the less common species. You might then add to that collections of cuttings of a plant like bugle, and you might buy some plants of something like wood anemone. So I think whichever way you do it, it's a very rewarding and worthwhile thing to do, and the results can be very positive. So sorry about the size of the presentation, but that's all I'd like to say there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Giles. That was really interesting, looking at all the different options available. Right, we're going to move swiftly on to back to Rick, who's going to talk about establishing plots of woodland plants, some recent successes and failures.
Has that all come up for everybody?
Yep, that's great, thanks.
So I'm going to run through some early results of a small project, essentially using the approach set out in the interim guidance. So we have 3 trial sites, one at Balkello Community Wood near Dundee, one at Cobblebray Community Woods on the outskirts of Falkirk, and we're just also starting plots at Scotia Seeds premises in Brechin. These woods are closed canopy or coming up to closing canopy. The oldest are at first thinning stage. The existing ground flora is typically poor. We're establishing plots 8 by 8 meters fenced with temporary plastic fencing. And we also have small areas outside the fence, which were planted up as a kind of quick look-see to illustrate what happens when you try to establish plants without protection from deer. Planting was by a mix of direct seeding and planting rooted cuttings and plug plants. And so this is a report of the state of play 3 years into a 5-year project. So starting with Balkello, Dundee, this was reasonably successful. You can see on the left-hand side, you've got an area within one of our fence plots. And on the right-hand side, an untreated area. We've established 16 species here, and at year 3, we've got 9 of them flowering. So again, on the left of the picture there is outside the plot. On the right-hand side, you can see primroses and the inevitable red campion getting going there. And our main successes were Herb Robert, Enchanter's Nightshade, red campion, and hedge woundwort from seed. Also at Balkello under oak, with a plot on the right-hand side there, and you can see the red campion, which always gets away to a good start. And you can also see here plants established outside the fence, suggesting that we can at least establish some plant species in the face of moderate deer population. Now, main successes here were primrose, bluebell, greater stitchwort, and red campion. This is under alder, and you can see leaves there of wild garlic getting going from seed. 9 species established again, 4 of which are flowering at year 3. The picture there is golden and saxifrage and celandines. And the other successes are again Enchanter's Nightshade, hedge woundwort, and wild garlic. At this site, we had a problem with invasion of creeping buttercup that came in as soon as we thinned the trees on this site immediately before starting work, and it set off conditions that were suitable for creeping buttercup to invade from outside the plot. Some species coped with this and others didn't. On the left, you can see here, this is golden saxifrage that got going to that kind of area from 3 small plug plants in the course of 3 years. So that operated underneath the buttercup just fine. On the right-hand side here, we've got Enchanter's Nightshade, which was some plug plants and was able to get above the canopy of the creeping buttercup. So on to Cobblebray at Falkirk. Well, this was a complete failure. In the course of 9 months, everything we planted failed to establish, and it was quite a sobering experience. And this included robust plug plant subspecies like greater stitchwort and bugle and sorrel, which are wood sorrel, which at other sites have romped away. We've not been able to ascertain the cause. My suspicion is strongly that it was mainly slugs. If you look at the site, you can see it's a near monoculture of meadow grass, quite unusual. This is unique in my experience. There are no reports from other projects of this happening. There are no reports in the literature. It would be nice to know exactly why that happened, but we haven't had resources to follow up on that site. So these were some of the plug plants which grew absolutely fine for about 6 months and then all disappeared in the course of winter and the following spring. So the main lessons I think can be drawn out from this project so far. Firstly, the important one, it is possible to fail on some sites. Secondly, existing vegetation is a hindrance on some sites, but not always. If it is a hindrance, it's definitely best to get decent control of that. If you can't get control of the vegetation, for example, where the buttercup got into our older plots, it's best to use plug plants of particular species that can cope with the competition. We found it's generally better to carry out establishments in areas of deeper shade where there's less vegetation rather than in more open areas with more vegetation. But obviously that depends somewhat on the characteristic of the species. So there is a sort of assessment needs to be made of the shade tolerance of the species that you're establishing. Some species failed to establish properly and gave us quite a surprise. So dog violet from seed at Balkello more or less failed, whereas it grows just fine when you plant it in seed trays. And from plug plants, we had problems with wood sorrel, but it's worth mentioning that was planted into a very severe spring drought in 2018, which was certainly an influence there. On the other hand, some species did unexpectedly well from seed. So Enchanter's Nightshade, Primrose, Herb Robert, Wild Garlic were some of the best, and they prospered despite the drought. Some species established fairly well outside of the fence plots and in the presence of moderate deer pressure. And the poster child for this was the golden saxifrage that I showed you. That operated very well outside the plots as well. Primrose is very hardy in this respect. Others don't do so well. Deer are very partial to red campion, particularly the flowers. They also browsed wood cranesbill and figwort quite enthusiastically. So I'm starting to get very interested in the relative palatability of different woodland plant species. It was becoming obvious that flowering of most species was far better inside the fence plots compared with outside. So whilst we might be able to establish some plant species in the face of moderate deer pressure, their flowering and therefore potentially their seeding and colonization will be impeded. For species that don't operate well from seed, propagation from plant fragments works just fine, but it's hard to get sufficient plants from a large number of unrelated parents. That's just quite a lot of work doing cuttings like that. And finally, I'm becoming more in favor of using plug plants to establish these plots, and a little bit more wary of relying solely on seed just to reduce the risks. But as Giles pointed out, it's a more expensive way of doing things. And finally, I'd just like again to thank my partners and funders.
That's great. Thanks very much, Rick. Right, we're now going to move into our second discussion period. We've still got quite a lot of questions to answer, so I will try and go through them as quickly as possible to get as many of them answered as possible. If we don't get to all of them, then we'll answer them and make the answers available along with the webinar link on the website. So starting off with, we've got a question which I think Colin is going to answer, and it's around, would the same approach to re-establishing these plant communities be applicable to upland woodland restoration?
Gosh, I suspect so, but I think there are others here who've been looking at the evidence more closely than I have, who may want to chip in. I mean, I think the premise that was set up at the beginning here was that this was focused primarily on lowland ex-agricultural sites, where it's fairly clear that the seed sources for these species are not actually present. Where there is a seed source nearby and where there may be viable dormant seeds present, then they often sufficient to revegetate these sites. I suspect there will be very similar sites in the uplands. I think I saw one comment about moorland sites that had been repeatedly burnt, muir burned. And I suspect there will be a requirement to reintroduce some species in those. But as I say, the focus of this work was predominantly the lowland broadleaved areas. And I think there's maybe a bit of work to be done. I think Rick's got his hand, so he's probably going to be able to answer more fully than I have.
I just say that provided a woodland is assessed for the species that are present and the species that might colonize into it, and found to be lacking in that respect, that can happen in the uplands equally well. And if it fits that criteria, I would say that it's a potential candidate, particularly if it's been in the landscape for 20 or 30 years and nothing has shown up. And I've certainly got a project where I've introduced plants into secondary regeneration of birch on a former sort of semi-moorland site, and it's been spectacularly successful. And it's very clear to see the areas where we've done the translocation and the sort of far more limited flora elsewhere. So I think provided you're careful, it applies to the uplands as well.
Thanks very much, Rick.
Can I just add
yeah.
there, Alex? You will, no doubt, many of you'll be aware that many of the plants, the woodland plants that are associates of upland woodlands anyway, occur in the more open vegetation. So you've all seen bluebells out on the hill. You quite often see wood anemone, wood sorrel. A lot of these plants are just out in the vegetation, and they will be present in the seed bank in upland sites as well. So I think the possibilities of colonization in upland planting sites probably better, much better than they are in the sort of lowland situations that we are talking about in the guide.
Thanks, Kate. Our next question is there guidance on the density of plug planting, including patch size? Is that one Giles can answer?
I think I should probably say there is some basic guidance in the report, but I can't recall exactly what we said, but we have drawn that information together, what little there is. But I'd say there's still plenty of experimentation and trials that can be done to figure this out better, because we're still at this early stage of understanding the process of forming these types of plots.
Thanks. Next question, does soil improvement act as a barrier to recolonization of specialist woodland plants? We had a couple of questions around that.
Could you repeat that? Does what act as a barrier?
Does soil improvement act as a barrier to recolonization of specialist woodland plants?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that it does, and that is one of the reasons why leaving works until you get to canopy closure is potentially a good idea, because you've had 15 or 20 years for that excess nitrogen and phosphate to leach out of the soils. My view is it's mainly mediated by the fact that it encourages the competing vegetation, rather than it's a problem for the woodland plants growing in a rich soil. Certainly when I've planted out a wide variety of woodland plants into very good soil in my garden, they're all perfectly happy and grow just fine. But I think they get overcome by the vigorous vegetation that is promoted by the agricultural improvement. So I think my general advice would be, don't go in too early, because you're waiting for those nutrients to disappear, and try and get control of the existing vegetation on the site.
That's great, thanks, Rick. This one, perhaps for Giles, for cuttings or fragments, how do you handle them on the day of collection, and did you plant them out the same day as collection? A practical question.
Yeah, I think in general, you need to handle them so that they don't dry out. That would be the most important thing, and then you can either plant them the same day, or you can grow them on a bit. I mean, it's a way of perhaps moving the material on to the next stage, so that it roots and can be treated more as plants rather than as cuttings. So I think it's going to depend on the situation for a particular site, I think, and the circumstances that you have yourself as you deal with it.
Thank you. Somebody, Dave Tucker, is saying we have had an explosion of borage comfrey along the verges over the last 5 years. Should we be controlling it? It seems invasive. Who would like to take that one? Is that one for you, Kate?
Goodness, I don't really know. No, I mean, I've seen also comfrey doing very well in woodlands this year, and borage is, it's a plant that is very well able to colonize bare ground, and it will do so if it's in a location. They're good for invertebrates, good for pollinators, both of them very good for pollinators. I don't know if you're talking about the non-native or the native comfrey. But I don't know if any of the others are able to comment on that. Sorry, I don't know any more.
That's fine. That's fine. We've got one, I think, probably best for Colin to address. Do you envisage this type of planting being supported by public funding? And if so, will there be legislation to consider such as FRM control on provenance of seed sources?
Yeah, so there was a couple of questions regarding funding through the grant system. So there isn't any funding options at the moment for woodland creation sites for this type of work. And we don't grant fund restocking. That's part of the expectation of a felling permission that's provided. There is an option to look at that in the future, but this isn't really something that forestry would consider to be essential or an essential part of woodland creation, because it really starts, as has been explained a couple of times this morning, it starts to become more important when you get to about year 20 to start to consider what is present or what is absent and think about it at that point. And that's well beyond the lifetime of the short 5-year grant schemes that we normally have running. The other thing I would say, there was another question was asking about, and I can tick off 3 here, you see, about woodland expansion from existing seed sources and natural regeneration rather than planting. And absolutely agree with that. If there's an opportunity to expand native woodlands from existing remnant areas, then we should be doing that where we can. It is an option that's supported by Scottish Forestry, and we do have grants in place to pay for natural regeneration that's been successful in achieving a certain density of plants. So we would encourage that as much as possible. But again, reiterate the point that this is really looking at establishment on some of the agricultural sites or ex-agricultural sites where there may not be existing native woodlands remnants that we can adjoin or we can benefit from. So each system has its place, and this is looking specifically at those areas where this is not something that we will get the woodland flora to develop naturally in. So we need to look at supporting it. But no, I'm sorry, there's not any grant support at the moment.
Thanks, that's great.
Can I come in there, Alex, and just say something quickly? Not to naysay what Colin's just said, but this is the start of this conversation, and the work has identified that there are things that can be done. A lot of the things that can be done are fairly low cost things, and they're great things that people can get involved in doing, whether it's, schools. I think somebody in the question has raised the possibility of schools collecting seed and growing on plants, planting out into, for example, community woodlands. So this is the sort of thing that I think we are at the beginning of the process here. This is great for biodiversity. It's great for pollinators. It's all round a good thing. And I think that something that we're going to discuss a bit later in the webinar, before the end of the webinar, is the possibility of having a forum where we start to share knowledge and experience and ideas around this whole subject. There's a lot of interest, a lot of enthusiasm, and it could well be that that enthusiasm could build into something where Nature Scot or Scottish Forestry realise that this is something that they need to put some funding behind, because we are in a biodiversity extinction crisis. And yeah, so I think it's something, it's out to all of you to continue the conversation and to keep applying pressure where you can, and just to encourage more people to get involved and to work and to do work on the ground. Yeah, thanks, Alex.
That's great, thanks, Kate. And that's a really good place, I think, to end. We've run out of time, sadly, but we've got one little bit left, just as Kate was talking about, to introduce the idea of an online forum, and we've got a poll for you to answer. But firstly, I'd just like to thank all the panelists. You've been fantastic, and speakers, all the information. You've taken us really through an awful lot this morning, a lot of good information. Thanks to all the participants and for all your questions. It's been great. I'm sorry we haven't got through all of them, but we will try to answer them, as I say, and put the answers alongside the copy of the webinar. So you should now see a poll on your screen. Would you be interested in participating in an online forum for sharing expertise and experience and promoting responsible woodland plant translocations? You just need to click yes or no and submit your answer. And then if there's enough support for this, then it's something we will definitely look to move forward. But I'll just give you a few minutes to do that. Kate, are there any final things you would like to say in summing up, other than just thanking everybody for coming along?
Yeah, it's been, I can't believe an hour and a half has gone past so fast. There is so much to talk about here. I mean, scrolling through the questions, there's some excellent questions, and we've only been able to answer a few of them. I think I'm right in saying, Tim will correct me if I'm wrong, that we, the panelists, can answer, and if that is right, then we will answer the questions that are still outstanding, that haven't been addressed so far. But the level of interest is obvious in the questions that have come forward, and experience. A lot of you, I know, are already doing this and trying things out in your own woods. And so this is the idea behind the forum. I mean, I don't know how many of you are aware of the Grazing Animal Project Forum. Nibblers is a similar thing for managing mainly grassland or open ground habitats, grazing with, using grazing animals. Works really, really well as a Google platform. And we had the idea that perhaps there would be an interest in some sort of online forum to support this kind of work, where people who are doing things can share their experiences, ask their questions, get information from other people, share research that's been published, that kind of thing. But it would need a moderator, and our understanding from the Nibblers project that this is not a big job, but it obviously is a job. It takes somebody to be checking the emails and putting them out to the forum a couple of times a week. And it may need a little bit of funding as well. So this is something, if anybody is interested in either potentially funding or potentially hosting or moderating such a forum, could you please email me? My email is kate.hall@nature.scot, and it's in the presentation as well. So it'd be good to hear from you. It would be good to know, Tim, while I'm rabbiting on here, whether you have the results of the poll, just so that we can all hear just how much interest there is in having such a forum.
I saw something flash up, 94% after 57 votes so far. So that's a very high proportion of people supporting.
So there's definitely an interest, which I suppose isn't surprising, judging by the level of engagement. So then, you know, if anybody feels that they have the capacity to start to take this forward, then please email me, and depending on the response that I get, we can take this forward with some of the other panelists who are here today. But yeah, in the meantime, I would just like to thank everybody for your presentations, brilliant presentations. Thank you so much. Thank you to all the panelists, to all the participants for being there and what you're doing and your questions. And yeah, hopefully this is the start of an ongoing conversation.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.